So this tutorial is going to show you how to create editable tables with jQuery and Ajax. And this can really be applied to any kind of web page. It doesn't have to be necessarily a table on a page. You can apply this to any element, but for simplicity's sake, we're just going to be doing this with a table. And so what you need to do is populate your table from the database. And so I've got mine already set up here, just creating the table and populating it using PHP directly from my database. And then once we have that table created, then we need to first go ahead and include our jQuery library so that we can access jQuery. And the easiest way to do this is if you go to scriptsrc.net, then you can actually just copy and paste the entire script tag. You don't actually need to do any work, so you just come here, you go to jQuery and click on copy, and it copies the entire script tag in there, so not just the address, but the entire tag. And this website will actually always grab the most recent copy of the jQuery library, so you know that your link is always the most up-to-date if you're grabbing it from there. And it just makes everything easier for us. And then what we're also going to do is we are going to be creating a separate script to hold our jQuery so that it's not just mucking up our page. So I'm just going to be calling mine edit.js. So now we've got that included. And so we just need to go ahead and create our script. So I've already got one created here. I'm just going to go ahead and comment that out, and we'll start from scratch so that you can see every step of the process here. And so to start with, anybody who's not familiar with jQuery, all jQuery function calls are going to be with a $sign. And the $sign is just a shortcut to jQuery. And basically, the jQuery library is just a way of accessing JavaScript. So when you use that jQuery symbol, all it's really doing is calling a special custom-defined function that has all sorts of lesser functions within it that you're calling on. So the $sign is actually just a shortcut. If you put in $sign and then your parentheses, it's the same as actually saying jQuery and then the parentheses. So it's just a shortcut. So what we're going to be doing here is we want to initialize the editing on our page as soon as the page finishes loading. So in this case, jQuery has a shortcut for us where all we have to do is pass it a function within the parentheses, and then it will basically be the same as document.ready for any of you who are familiar with that. So as soon as the page finishes loading, then it will call this anonymous function. And then within that function is where we want to call everything that we want it to do. So in this case, we want to listen for any time one of our table elements is clicked. And if it's clicked, then we want to be able to edit it. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to say for any TD element, when it's clicked, do this. And so what I'm using here is the on method. jQuery's on method you can also use .click. .click will actually be the same thing as calling .on. The only reason I use .on is it's a little bit more efficient. If you call .click, it's actually a shortcut to the on method. If you were to look within jQuery library itself, you'd see that when you call .click, it actually just calls .on and then passes it the click parameter. So they both will do the exact same thing. Doesn't really make a difference, so if you already use click and you're familiar with it, go for it. Doesn't make any difference whatsoever. And then when someone clicks on the TD element, we want to display a form so that they can edit it. So we'll say display form. And then the display form, obviously, we haven't actually defined yet. That's going to be a custom function that we're going to be creating. And then to make things easier on ourselves, we're going to pass it this. And the this keyword refers to whatever the current object is. So in this case, this within the click is going to be whatever was clicked on. So this will be whatever TD element was clicked on that triggered this function. And by wrapping the this within the jQuery, it tells it that this is a jQuery object and we want to be able to use jQuery functions with it. So when we click, we're calling the display form function, and then we're passing it the cell that was clicked on so that we're able to manipulate that cell within the function without actually having to try to find it elsewhere. And so that's the only thing that we need up here within our anonymous function here. So when the document loads, it's going to attach that event handler, so it's going to listen for any time that TD is clicked, and then when it is clicked, it's going to call this display form method. So now we just need to create that display form method. And within the display form method, we're going to refer to the this that we pass to it as cell. A little bit more intuitive for us so that we know exactly what we're talking about. So the cell that's clicked is what we're dealing with. And then we want to grab some information before we actually start processing anything here. So what we're going to want to do first is we're going to want to create a variable for the column of the database. And in this case, for simplicity's sake, I have just named my rows with the primary key in the database. And then I've named my table cells with the individual columns in the database. So the column name is actually just going to be the class on that particular table cell on the TD element, and then the ID is going, or the primary key is going to be the ID on my TR elements. So to get the column, what we're going to want to do is we're going to grab cell.attr, which is just attribute, class. And what that's going to do is it's going to grab cell, which is this that we passed through, so that's the TD that was clicked on. So it's going to say for that cell that was clicked on, grab the attribute class. And because of the way that I named it, the class on that cell is going to be the name of the column in the database. And then once we have the column name, we want to go ahead and grab the primary key on the database. So that's going to be the ID on the table row. Now, since obviously the cell that we passed is just the TD element, not the TR, we need to actually get up to its parent row. And so we're going to do cell.closest. And closest is a jQuery function that's just going to look upwards in the DOM. It's going to start going through parents until it finds a matching element, in this case a TR. So since a TD is a direct child of the TR, it's just going to go up one level. It's going to say, oh, there's a TR. It's going to stop. And then we want to grab the ID, in this case, of the row, because the ID is going to give us the primary key for the database. So we're going to do the attr again, and then ID. And jQuery is fairly intuitive on how the functions work. Pretty much everything, if you say it, it sounds exactly like what it's doing. And then once we have both of those, we need everything we need to work with the database. So now we need some information for what we want to do with the table on the page. So first thing we're going to do is we are going to grab the width of the particular cell that was clicked on. And the reason we're going to do this is that once we display the form on the page for a user to be able to edit, we want to make sure that it takes up all of the available space. So this way it gives them all the space that they need to work on it. And it's just an easy way to make sure that it's a good size for the page. You can, of course, make this custom, whatever you want. I'm just keeping it simple and making it just the width of the cell. And it will change depending on which kind of cell you're clicking on. And so to grab the cell width, we want to basically just grab the CSS attribute that has already been applied to that cell. My table already has set widths for all of the cells on there. And so I'm going to use cell.css, and CSS will just grab whatever attribute I'm asking about, which is width. And then once we have the width, we want to know what is already in that cell. So when someone clicks on it, we want to pre-populate it with what was already in there. And so to do that, we're going to do cell.text. Oh, and we want to do, and I'm just going to call this previous content, or prev content, and then that's going to be cell.text, and that's going to give us the contents of that cell. And then the last thing that we need is we need to create the code for the form itself. And so what we're going to do here is I'm just going to name this variable form, and we're going to start the form tags. And the action on this, we want to make sure that when someone is submitting this form, it's going through the way we want it to be processed. It's not actually sending it to the page as it normally would, because that's just going to refresh the page and defeat the whole purpose of doing this through Ajax to begin with, and it's not going to process properly. So what we want to do is we want to say JavaScript this.prevent default. So that'll just tell it that rather than doing what you would normally do to process a form, we want you to do nothing. And then we don't need to actually have a method in here, post or get, because the way that this is actually going to be handled is we're going to be taking all of the form data directly out of the code and handling it ourselves. So there doesn't need to be any method on there because we're not actually using a standard method. We're going to be handling this in a custom way. And then the only input field that we need on here is going to be a text box. And that text box, we can just name that new value. And the size, we can just put it at, say, 4. We're actually going to be changing that to a custom size, so it's not going to make any difference. And then we want the value, which is going to be what's already in there, to be what we just grabbed. So previous content. And then once we have our text field, we're going to create a couple different hidden fields. So first, we want to create a hidden field that's going to hold the primary key for the database. And we're just going to call that ID. And then the value is going to be what we already grabbed for the ID. And then we're going to create a second hidden field. And this one's going to be the column in the database. And then the value on that is, again, going to be the column variable that we already just grabbed. Oh, don't want to leave that out. And then we can close out our form. So those hidden fields are just basically serving the purpose of telling us what column and what row we're working on in the database. And by making them as a hidden field, this isn't something that the user is going to need to know. It's just something that we want to be sent along. And we could grab this and send it on manually, but by making it a hidden field, it's just all there in the form. So when we send on the form for processing, it has all the information that it needs to know. And now that we've got all of the variables that we need to work with, we just want to come in here and put the form into the field. So to put the form into the table, we want to take that cell, which is the same cell that we've been working with. It's the one that was clicked on. And we want to say .html. And the HTML is going to do one of two things. If you don't pass it any parameters, the HTML function will return whatever is within that cell, and it will return it in the HTML form. So if you've got a form, it'll return all this code for the form versus just the visible text, which is what .text will get you. And if you pass it a parameter, which we're going to go and pass it form, if you pass HTML a parameter, it will replace the HTML that's in that cell with whatever you pass it. So cell.html form is going to put that form code that we just created directly into the table. And then once we've inserted that in, one of the great things about JavaScript in general is you can chain these commands. So when you're using jQuery, you don't need to make a bunch of separate commands. I could do this in more than one, but if I want to, I can just chain them. So in this case, I'm going to do find, and I'm going to find that text field we just created, and I'm going to change the focus to that text field. So basically what we're doing here is we are taking the cell that we clicked on, we're inserting the form into that cell, then we're finding that text box that we just put in there, and we're making it the focus so that the cursor will be in there so that when you click, you don't have to click again, so that your cursor is in the box and ready to go. And then Dot focus will also actually highlight the text if you're using Chrome. And if you're using other browsers, it'll just put the cursor in here at the end. If you want it to actually highlight the text in other browsers, you can also put in a dot select, and that'll work in like Firefox, things like that as well. But that's not really necessary for what we need here, so I'm going to leave that out. So once we've made that the focus, we also want to make sure that we've got the width set to what we wanted it to be. So we're going to use .css, just like we did to grab the width originally. And CSS, if you use that function without any second parameter, it will just grab you the value that's in that CSS property. And if you do pass it a second value, then it will actually change that property to whatever the second value is. So here we're inserting the form into the cell. We're finding that text field that we just put in there. Oh, that looks like I was missing a square bracket. And then we're making that text field the focus so that our cursor's in it. And we're making it fit the width of the cell. And that way we've got our input displaying, and it's taking up all of the available space. Now, once we've got that form in there, one thing we do want to make sure to do, and there's a couple different ways to do this, but the way I'm going to do it is we're just going to attach a new handler to the cell, and all we're going to do is say return false. And the only reason we're doing this is that when someone clicks on the cell, if we don't do this, it's going to rerun all of this code because it's been clicked on again. Now, the only problem with that is because we've grabbed this original value, if you click on the cell again, we're just going to lose that original value. So to prevent it from recreating the form every time you click on it, we're just going to add this new handler that takes precedence that's going to be when someone clicks, just return, do nothing. And so that way when someone clicks on it, it will still, move the cursor in the field, do whatever you want to do, manipulating it with the mouse in there, but it's not going to trigger any kind of jQuery reaction. And so once we've got that disabled, now we need to handle what's going to happen when someone is done. So we want to know what we want to listen for to know when someone's done and what to do when they are done. So in this case, we're actually going to want to listen for a couple things, but we're going to listen for them both in the same way. So we're going to do cell again, because we're still listening on the same cell that we clicked on. And we're going to say on key down. And that's going to be anytime a key is pressed. And then within our anonymous function here, we're actually going to pass it a variable. In this case, I'm just going to use e. And what that does is when you are reacting to a key down event, that variable in there is how you're going to interact with it. So in this case, we want to check if someone has pressed a key, what key have they pressed? And then depending on what key they've pressed, we determine what to do. Now, most keys, we don't want to do anything, because if they're typing in the field, we don't want to be triggering some event every single time they're, typing. But if they press certain keys, we do want to do something. So in this case, we want to listen for if they press enter. If they press enter, that's going to be our cue to submit. And so we're going to say e.keycode. And then 13 is the key code for enter. And so if they press enter, we're telling it, then we want to do something. And you can actually find the key codes at ASCIItable.com. The key codes are just the ASCII codes. So you can find all sorts of tables online where you can go and look them up. Every key has its own ASCII code. That's how the computer understands it. So anytime you press a key, if you press, say, the letter A, the computer is not hearing you're pressing the letter A. What it's actually hearing is the number of what key you pressed. So if you look here, 97 is a lowercase a. So when you press any key on the keyboard, every key is just a code to the computer, and it knows what all of these codes do. So it knows if you press code 97, it wants you want it to put this little symbol into the whatever document you're working on. So when we're listening for the key press, when we listen for 13 here, that's a carriage return. So when you hit enter, it's triggered by that. So every key, even if it doesn't show anything on the screen, it's being sent to the computer in the exact same way. So we're just listening for the particular key presses that we want, and we're looking up in the table which ones we're interested in. So here, when they've pressed key code 13, which is enter, we're going to call a function which we'll define in a second here, which is going to be called change field. And then we're going to pass that change field function that cell that we've been working with, and we're also going to pass it the previous content. And we're just going to pass that previous content as a way to put that back in. If there's a problem updating the database, we'll just say there was an error, we'll put the previous content back in the cell. And by passing it through there, it makes it easy for us to do. And then what we're also going to do, just to make it a little more user-friendly, is we want to see if they press cancel or escape. And if they press escape, then we're going to cancel. So we're going to say if e.keycode is 27, then we want to take the contents of that cell, and we want to put the original value back in there. And then we want to remove that click handler that we put on that's going to prevent it from recreating the form every time. So right up here, we're just removing this because we don't need to stop it from being clicked to edit anymore once we have reverted the cell back to its original value. So all we're doing here is you click on it, it becomes editable. If you hit escape, it puts whatever the original value was back in there, and you can see if I were to make changes in here and then hit escape, it's just going to still take the original value. It's going to put it right back in that field, and then it's going to re-enable the editing by removing that second click handler that we put on there. And then that's all that we've got to do within this display form function here. So next we want to create our change field function. Okay, so there's a couple things that we're going to want to do here. First thing we want to do is, since now we are basically sending all our data in for processing, we no longer need to be listening for any key presses. So we don't need to know if they're pressing enter anymore. We don't need to know if they're pressing escape anymore. It's just not important to us anymore. So we're going to do cell.off, key down, and that way we're just no longer listening for it. And then we're going to be using a function called getJSON, or JSON. And the only thing that we're going to be needing to pass to that is the form that we just had filled out and where we want to send it. So what we're going to be doing here is we're just going to assign this to variables to make it easier to work with. And in my case, I'm just using a script called ajax.php, which I'm going to be using to process the data that's being sent for the database. And this can be named whatever you want. It can be in whatever directory you want. I've just got all in the same directory to make it easy. But if it is in a different directory, you do need to put that in here. So, you know, whatever directory you put it in, make sure that's in the URL as well. It would be relative to wherever you are. And then, in addition to just the URL itself, I'm going to pass it edit. And all that's for is when I go in to actually process this, I want to check, is the edit variable set? If it's set, good, that means that this is an editing request, and I'm going to process it accordingly. Now, in the context that we've got here with something so simple, it's not really necessary to do that, but it's a good habit to be in, because if you later have a processing script that handles 3 different kinds of requests, you want to be able to easily tell which one you're receiving. You don't want to just automatically start processing it in every single way. And so that just takes that out of the picture altogether. And then the next thing that we're going to be needing to pass is the form data. So what we want to do is we'll just call this input, and we are going to grab the form. So we're going to say within that cell, find the form for me, and then we're going to use the serialize function. And the serialize function just takes some HTML or whatever you have, and it's, in this case, the form, going to take it and encode it for sending via URL. So it's basically just encoding it in URL format so that it can be sent directly through the URL. And this is the reason that we didn't need to set the method. We didn't need to say get or post because it's being set by get. It's being sent through the URL by serializing it and then passing it directly using get JSON. So what we're going to do now is this get JSON. There are a few different ways that you can do this in jQuery or in general. I'm using getJSON for a couple reasons. One, it only takes a couple of parameters that you actually need, so it's fairly simple to use. And two, it is easy to handle several different kinds of data that you're getting back. So for instance, with .load, you'll send off a request and then it will take whatever you have received as the response and automatically reinsert it into whatever element you called it from. In a lot of cases, that's not going to be what you want. You might want to actually respond differently depending on what comes back. So by using getJSON, you actually will have the chance to interact with the data before it goes back into your page. So it's just a little more flexible and easier to use. So what we need to do here is we want to pass it the URL, and then we're going to tack that form input onto the end of the URL. And then we're going to pass a second parameter, which is a callback function. And in the parameters for the callback function, we want to pass it a variable. I'm just using data. And that variable that we pass to it is what it's going to use to hold the response back from your processing script. So it's going to send the form values off to ajax.php. And when ajax.php is done and it sends back a response, that response is going to be stored in the data variable. So that's just how I'm going to access what comes back. And then within the callback function, what we want to do here is I'm going to just be checking to see if it was updated in the database successfully, and I'm just going to use a flag for that called success. And these obviously are created in the processing script, so we'll get to the actual code for these in a minute. But if it was successful and it was able to update the database, we're just going to say cell.html data.value. And so what we're doing here is we're just inserting into that cell the new value that the user entered. So this value is actually just a variable that was sent back from the processing script. And when you're accessing multiple variables that were sent back, you'll use the name of your variable, in this case data, dot whatever it is. So data dot success, that means that I have had sent back something called success that told it whether it was successful. Data dot value, I had sent back the user's input in a variable called value. And we'll take a look at how that can be done in PHP at least when we get to the processing script. And then if it's not successful, then we know that there was a problem and it wasn't able to update the database. So we want to just print out an error message. Okay, so it's just going to pop up with an alert dialog saying there was a problem updating the data, please try again. And then after it alerts you, it's going to go and put the original value back in. This was why we passed in the original value when we created this function, just for this circumstance. So if it wasn't able to update the database, print out an error that tells them there was a problem, and then update the contents of the cell so that it's whatever it was before we tried to update it. And then the last thing that we need to do within our change field function is we want to do exactly the same thing as we did if you canceled the change. We want to remove that click handler that we had put on there that stops it from recreating the text field when it's already there. So to do that, we just do the same thing as we did before, cell.off, click. And now that's all we have to do for our jQuery portion. So that is completely functional. And we'll go ahead and save that. And then all we need to do now is handle the processing side. So for the processing side, first thing we're going to be doing is including the database. And so obviously this is not the right database information, but you're just going to go in, create your database connection. In this case, I'm using PDO, so I've just created a database connection object, and then I'm going to be using that throughout my script. And then it's a short enough script, we might as well just go ahead and redo this one as well while you're watching. And so basically all we're saying is, remember we had passed that edit variable through the URL. And so since we did that, we're just going to say if it's set, then we're going to do the processing. And then we are going to go ahead and grab all of the data out of the form. So remember we had a field for column. So we're going to grab the get column. And we had one for the primary key in the database. So we're going to grab that one. And then we had the input from the user, which we called new value. So we're going to grab that one. And then once we have that, we're just going to write our statement to insert or update that in the database. So update, in this case, my database table is called course. And we're going to set whatever the column was to the new value, where the primary key was whatever the primary key was that we got. And so I'm doing this using PDO and prepared statements. So these two here are just placeholders, which I'm going to be binding, which is just a little bit more secure, which kind of moot with the way that I've been doing it here, just because I've been skipping validation altogether for simplicity's sake, but good habit to be in. So we're going to create our prepared statement. And then we're going to bind those parameters. And that just means that those placeholders that I put in with the colons are now going to be referring to whatever the value is in the variables that I'm passing. So in this case, it's going to be the new value, and the ID variables are going to take the place of this colon value and colon ID. And then what we're going to do next is we want to create two different variables to be sending back. So when I execute this update statement, I want to check if the update was successful. And this is easy enough in PHP. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start a response variable that's an associative array, and I'm going to give it a success element. And then when you're using prepared statements, the execute command that updates will actually return true or false for success or failure. So when this executes, if it was able to update the database correctly, it's going to return true. Otherwise, it's going to return false. So that's how I'm going to set my success flag. Okay, so now that we've got the success flag, we need to get the new value sent back so that we can use it in the jQuery script. So we're going to create a second element to the response array called value. And remember before when we had looked at the callback function for the getJSON, we have data.value, data.success. So this is coming directly from here. When you have an associative array in PHP that you're sending back to the getJSON function, it's going to be accessed using the variable name dot and then the array key. And so we're going to set the value to new value, which is whatever the user put in. And then the only thing left we have to do is to send that information back. So there's two things that we need to be aware of when we're doing this. First is to send anything back to the getJSON function. All we have to do is do what we would do to print it out to the screen. So in this case, I'm going to echo it. And whatever would display on the screen if you were actually viewing the processing script in the browser is what will be sent back to the getJSON function. So by echoing that out, it's the same as sending it. And then the second thing that we need to do is, because this is the getJSON function, it will actually require that it be in JSON format. And in PHP, that's fairly easy. You just do JSON encode response. And that will put it into JSON format, which, for anybody who doesn't know, that's JavaScript object notation. And it's just a way of sending it, and it works great for associative arrays because they're essentially the same format anyway. It's just a little different structure to it. And so that just sends it in a format that's universal, and this also makes it more universal in terms of what language you're using for the processing script. I've used PHP here, but as long as the response that you send back is in JSON, it doesn't matter what language you're using for processing, any server-side scripting language will do. And so you just need to send it back in this JSON encoded format. And then once you've got that sent back, then it will be able to read that, tell if it was a success in the update to the database. If it was, put that into the table and get rid of the editable field. And if it wasn't, then to display an error message and then put the previous content back into the field. So if we test that now and go ahead and refresh the page, when you click on the field, and this right here is a reason why you would want to be testing more often than I do, because obviously something's missing here because it's not actually editing properly. So if you come into the code here, I think what's going on is I forgot to delegate when I bound the original handler on there. So basically what we actually want to do is, instead of putting this click directly onto the TD, that would work fine in this circumstance because it's so simple, but if under circumstances where you've got a table that maybe is going to be having rows added after the page has been loaded, if you apply it directly to the TD and then you add more TD elements into the page, it won't actually be attaching that click handler to the new ones. So in order to make sure that this applies to all TDs, even if they've been loaded after the page was first loaded, then we need to actually delegate this. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to say tBody, and then after the onClick, we're going to pass it one more parameter that's the TD. And that's called delegating. And so basically what happens is anytime a TD is clicked, that event is going to bubble up to this tBody, and the tBody is what's actually going to be checking for that event. So instead of just when you click on the TD has this click attached to it, when you click on the TD, its parent, the tBody, is going to be waiting for a click, and when it hears a click, it's going to execute your functions. So that is also the reason that we had done the on-click return false, is I was doing that for the delegated method, but I didn't actually delegate it when I originally did it. So basically, we are attaching this click handler directly onto the TD, and that's taking the place of this because it's not actually going to bubble up to the tBody as long as you've got an actual event attached to the TD. So we bind this just basically blank click event onto the TD. It stops it from bubbling up and recreating that form when the form's already there, which is what's happening right now. So if I go back and refresh once I've got that saved, then now I can actually click in the field and it doesn't recreate the form and get rid of all of the previous content. So now if we go in here and we type something new and hit enter, then it updates it in the database. And if we hit escape, then it's canceling out of that. So that's all we have to do to get an editable table with jQuery and Ajax. And you can do a lot to expand this functionality. There's a lot of bells and whistles you can add on to it and other things that you can do along these lines. But this is the basics to get you started.